Greetings, Internet. I'm John Bailey, the Popcorn Junkie, and this is what I saw this week. Like I said in my last video, things are a bit up in the air right now. So the release schedule is what it is, and it's constantly in flux. So this is just what happens to have been available to me for this past week of January. So, let's get started. As a new year begins, so too are we mere plebeians deemed worthy to watch the awards bait movies for ourselves. One of the things that's always been a pet peeve of mine since I started to review movies is this carryover season of awards movies. Because awards like the Oscars require a movie be released in New York or LA for 2 weeks to qualify, a lot of the big contenders will do a limited release there to qualify, then eventually release the film wide to the rest of the country early the next year. One of my favorites from 2016, A Monster Calls, I wasn't even able to see until 2017 in January after I had finalized the end of the year lists. So now that the critics have laid out their best of 2020, and the films have officially qualified for the awards to come, we mere commoners are able to see the films for ourselves. No, I'm not bitter, why do you ask? In any rate, I finally wanted to catch up on one of the best from 2020 for a lot of people who got the chance to see it now that it's officially on Amazon Prime, and that is One Night in Miami. Based on the play of the same name by Kim Powers, who adapted the screenplay and directed by actress Regina King in her feature directorial debut, One Night in Miami tells a fictionalized account of the meeting of 4 iconic figures of black history: Cassius Clay, just before his conversion to Islam, Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke. When they meet, the egos clash as Malcolm's righteousness clashes with Sam's pride in black success, while Cassius struggles with his decision to convert as Jim Brown seeks out new venues, with him getting a bit too old to play football and still wanting to keep the peace with his friends. While the meeting goes on, the 4 men philosophize over the issues facing the black community, with Malcolm wanting to break free from the white society that has oppressed them for so long, and Cooke wanting to bridge the divide and help bring black and white people together, as well as them addressing the issues surrounding the Nation of Islam, as Malcolm X was preparing to leave it after starting to see corruption at the top levels. It's both powerful and kind of depressing how much of the topics discussed here are just as relevant almost 60 years later. As good as the writing and direction are, the real thing that propels this movie into just absolute excellence is the cast. Here, the cast exemplify their roles without being complete one-for-one impressions. I think my personal favorite performance is from Kingsley Ben-Adir as Malcolm X. Malcolm's arc in the movie is one of recognizing his own flaws and his own issues in his methods of fighting for the black community, and he eventually drops his usual facade of righteous fury to show real pain and emotion amongst his friends. That isn't to say the others are slouching either. They all give dynamite performances, right down to Aldous Hodge as Jim Brown, who is likely to get lost in all the passions of Malcolm X, Cassius Clay, and Sam Cooke, but who helps bridge the divides between the egos by understanding all sides of the conversation. If I were to amend my favorite list of 2020, then this would have a really tough spot contending against On the Record and the David Attenborough documentary for slots 2 through 4. It doesn't beat out the 40-year-old version just because that hits so close to home for me, but this is just some of the best film of 2020, and I can't recommend you check this out enough.
Represents the darkest part of the Bureau's history.
Last Monday was 2021's day to recognize the late, great Martin Luther King Jr., and most people probably spent it by sharing white-friendly quotes on social media when you know for a fact they would not have supported him if he were alive. In any case, we got the chance to celebrate it with a whole new documentary, and it does not hold back. If you've managed to avoid this knowledge until now, congratulations on making it out from whatever rock you were stuck under. Even if you were familiar with the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., seeing it play out in high definition just makes it all the more powerful. Whoever cleaned up the footage from that era did a fantastic job making it look good for modern screens. Which is good, because you want to recognize that pure, top-quality, vintage racism, because this was not that long ago.
It's crazy to see just how much manpower and energy was devoted to following King just to paint him as this dissident, as this violent threat to law and order, and their whole narrative could never manifest because the worst King did was to have extramarital affairs. He was never promoting violence, even in private, and he refused to be silenced. In seeing all this old footage, you also see that so many of the talking points and arguments against movements like Black Lives Matter were just always here. It's the same song and dance by people in authority, even 60 years later, because that's how little things have actually changed. Not to mention that J. Edgar Hoover wasn't some rogue agent imbuing his will on the country behind the scenes. The things he did were supported by the government and by the people at large. Robert Kennedy, as the Attorney General, signed off on the surveillance of King because nobody in the government at that time was innocent. There were no heroes because they all saw King's increasing influence as a threat to their hold on power. While the majority of the movie covers the FBI's obsession with toppling King as a civil rights leader, it also talks about how the National Archives' job of keeping these documents preserved for posterity, and how damning as they are, they can't be buried and forgotten. They need to be preserved and brought to the light. Not to mention, we get a chance to look further into King's backstory as the son of a pastor, and him seeking to use what was taught to him as a preacher to improve the world around him, and how after the Civil Rights and Voting Acts were passed, he struggled with voicing his opposition to the Vietnam War because of the threat it would cause to the progress they had already made with civil rights. When he finally spoke out, even the NAACP and the Urban League turned against him because they wanted to stay on President Johnson's good side. As well, some members of both organizations probably supported the Vietnam War in some regard. The information here is as important now as it was then, and it's presented in such a powerful way that it's one of the best I've seen from a documentary in a long time.
Like with One Night in Miami, this was another movie that was technically released in 2020, but didn't see a full official release until now, specifically to coincide with Martin Luther King Day. And in that case, I can't really put it on my top list of 2021, but if I were to put it on my list of 2020, it would top both On the Record and the David Attenborough documentary. So yeah, our first two movies this week were contenders for best of 2020 for sure. And yeah, I can't recommend you check this out enough. The thing about Netflix is their in-house productions can be very hit and miss. But when they buy up the rights to distribute an international production, sometimes they end up with better stuff than their originals, which is kind of the case here.
Based on the 2008 novel by Aravind Adiga, The White Tiger is a joint production between American and Indian studios and distributed by Netflix, with a limited theatrical run starting January 13th of this year. The story follows a poor, working-class driver in India who starts working for a wealthy couple, believing that becoming an invaluable servant will guarantee him steady pay and a chance to escape poverty, only for him to fight back against that very system when his employers try to throw him under the bus for an accident that they were responsible for.
One of the interesting things I've noticed about Indian cinema is just how open they are about criticizing things like classism and their systemic issues in film.
I can't speak about India's problems personally, obviously, but out of the Indian films I've seen, the filmmakers have never shied away from the problems the country faces, and this is no different. It hits almost all of the major beats: political corruption, abject poverty, living alongside obscene wealth, the caste system that's still in place. It never shies away from these issues, which is more than I can say about American cinema, which barely addresses systemic issues unless it's to garner award clout.
That said, while the themes in this movie are especially powerful, the way it's executed, not so much.
The trouble with adaptations is, unless you're familiar with the source material, it's hard to say what issues are from that source and what issues are just in the adaptation. My major issue is how the movie uses flashback and narration. It's not bad, but I feel like the trope doesn't really add anything to the story. You could have just told it linearly, and it actually would have probably been a little better. The narration here tries to add more philosophy to the story, but the actor doing the narrating isn't all that good at it, so it never really hits as hard as it thinks it does. On top of that, the movie never quite settles on a tone. One scene can be goofy and lighthearted, immediately followed by a dark scene full of violence, abject poverty, or death. The tone shifts are inconsistent too, so whatever sardonic style was intended never quite comes through in the execution. On top of that, the performances can be a bit hit and miss. They're fun enough for the most part, but some come off as wooden and stiff, even from the same actor from scene to scene. So it's harder to get hooked into the drama of the story when the actors aren't consistently able to deliver it. This is especially true of Adarsh Gurav, who, as the lead actor, can deliver great performances immediately followed by flat ones, and his whole narration is pretty wooden overall, so we don't get anything out of it.
That isn't to say this is a bad movie by any means either. I'd probably recommend it to you if you're interested in the topics, but honestly, I'd recommend things like Three Idiots or like Stars on Earth before I'd recommend this one. Now that 2021 is officially on the roll, we can finally talk about cancer.
I don't mean to diminish such a serious condition, but cancer is one of those topics that Hollywood loves to run into the ground. What for so many people is a battle just to survive is essentially a shortcut for dramatic writers. Cancer is a condition that will automatically cut straight to people's emotional cores. So for filmmakers, just bringing it up does most of the legwork for making audiences feel for the characters.
And I'm not saying that just talking about cancer is inherently exploitative. There's plenty of movies out there that deal with the topic in a heartfelt and emotional and genuine, honest way, but this was not one of them.
Maybe it's because the director Gabriella Cowperthwaite hasn't really proven herself as a narrative director following her breakthrough with Blackfish. Maybe it's just that the writer Brad Inglesby, who was also the writer of The Way Back from 2020, which I also thought was bland and relied too much on tropes without bringing any real personality to the movie, hasn't really shown himself to be all that compelling as a writer. But whatever the reason, this story just didn't work for me. I will say the biggest drain was Casey Affleck. I'm not sure why people keep casting Ben Affleck's douchey, rapey younger brother and stuff, but he is not good. I haven't seen him be anything more than average in any performance he's given. You could literally cast any other actor in the same role, and 9 times out of 10, you'd get a better performance out of the other guy. Meanwhile, Jason Segel and Dakota Johnson are fine actors, but they never really worked for me in this movie. Segel was fine enough for a dorky loser friend, and Johnson is thankfully not getting stuck in the same rut as Kristen Stewart did after Twilight, but she's also not really getting the best roles either. For a role that's supposed to allow her more moving, emotional performances, we only get a few scenes of that from her here. Otherwise, she's completely forgettable.
Hey, while we're speaking of emotional shortcuts, they decided to throw in the dog dying in this movie. Because cancer wasn't enough, I guess. Oh, and also, Arrested Development for some reason.
The thing about Arrested Development, the societal condition, not the TV show, is that it's also been mined pretty well by Hollywood. Hell, how much of Will Ferrell's career has been about that in one way or another? Yet for some reason, the screenwriter felt the need to throw in that as Jason Segel's character arc, as though he was dared to make a movie that's equal parts Our Idiot Brother and Love Story. It doesn't really have a reason to be here, but apparently this is all based on this actual person's life and all actual people, and so maybe the article that this is based on is more compelling since it's dealing with those real people, but the way that it was adapted here just didn't work for me.
Really, the most this movie does is just waste your time. So I can imagine why they weren't rushing to get this out for people to see, because there's no reason for people to rush out and go see it. And there's also no reason for Casey Affleck to keep getting work. Oh boy, going from cancer to the US-Mexico border. Great episode this week, John. People are gonna love it.
Being that this is a film review channel and not a political channel, I won't dig too into the radioactive stockpile that is the border discourse. Suffice to say that there isn't an easy answer to the mess that's been made after decades of terrible decisions, and making a movie about this subject is inherently going to be a rough sell since there's a lot of emotional investment into all sides of the discussion.
What I'm trying to get at is, if you're going to tackle this subject matter, you better bring your best when coming into this political and emotional minefield of a subject. And given the Allen brothers' other works, this may actually be their best. And even then, it wasn't that good.
I had never heard of Connor and Jake Allen before this movie. They seem to be mostly responsible for direct-to-video forgettable nothingness, and honestly, this isn't an exception. This has an interesting premise, but as I've said in my Blandest Movies of 2020 video, a good premise won't save your movie. It needs to have a good script, and then it needs to have good direction and a good cast. This has a serviceable cast, decent direction, but a completely forgettable script. This was another 2-hour slog that completely wastes its premise. I couldn't tell the characters apart. I never got hooked into the story. And for something as heated as the US-Mexico border discussion, it never really tackles it in a meaningful way.
There may come a point where the Allen brothers are actually interesting and make movies that are worth watching, but for right now, I don't expect them to rise far above the direct-to-video market. Well shit, we officially have our first terrible movie of 2021.
I will admit, I've never been much for sports movies. It's a genre that's never worked for me, but like every genre, it has plenty of good movies and a lot of mediocre to bad ones. Here, star of Boondock Saints and Boondock Saints 2 All Saints Day, Sean Patrick Flanery decided he wanted to star in a movie about jiu-jitsu, since he's a black belt in the martial art.
Unfortunately, he has a white belt in screenwriting, and he's not leveling up anytime soon.
This movie was such crap. Not even in a bad way. Like, it's not offensive crap, it's just bad filmmaking. The dialogue is garbage, the cast delivers that dialogue terribly, and the filmmaking is an absolute mess. Instead of just having a linear story, they decided to throw in this faux documentary style to treat these people like they're real. But it's not enough for this to be a full-on mockumentary. It's like they couldn't decide which they wanted to do and thought, ¿Por qué no los dos? But sucked at doing both, so it didn't matter. One of the aspects of the whole wannabe fake doc is that this movie is narrated by Flannery's best friend, and the actor sucks at narrating. I don't know if it's because they're having him do this whole affectation of an LA gangbanger, or if he's just not a good actor, but we're stuck with it for like 80% of the movie, and it sucks. Plus, for a martial arts movie starring an actual black belt in jiu-jitsu, the fight scenes are terribly cut, as though they're trying to hide the fact that these guys can't fight, when supposedly they can. The kicker to all of this is that the movie is so cheap. The costuming is cheap, the camera work is cheap, the effects are especially cheap. I'd honestly be shocked if this movie cost more than $1 million to make, besides paying for the cast.
I think the best example of this is how they tried to add Dennis Quaid to some grainy stock footage from the 90s, and they just basically green screened him over it like some rich kid high school morning announcements.
That's all bad enough, and I was willing to make fun of this and go about my merry way. Then there comes a line that is just the absolute worst. Not since Remember Me have we had a 9/11 reference needlessly shoehorned into a movie for a cheap reaction. This is absolutely reprehensible, and I couldn't care less about spoilers because there's no reason anyone should see this movie. Hell, Remember Me actually focused in on it and tried to give the 9/11 reference some reverence. Here it's just, oh yeah, 9/11 happened. Okay, bye.
That does it for this week. Next week we should be getting some new releases on Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max. There's supposed to be a Wrong Turn reboot or remake or something coming from Saban, so that's going to be garbage. So we'll have to wait and see what comes across my desk. So until next time, I'm John Bailey, and I actually had a sign-off from the podcast that I completely forgot to do. See you then, folks.